Hello, I'm Jackie Schertz. Welcome to Hey Listen. Today's topic is American Sign Language by choice. Our guests will be discussing their experiences as they were growing up, their frustrations and strategies for sign language and communication. We'll talk about when they became fascinated with American Sign Language. I grew up using sign language, but I didn't know that it was called American Sign Language. I didn't really have an idea about where my attitude was from. Stay with us and we'll continue this discussion. Welcome back. Today's issue is ASL, American Sign Language by choice. We have three guests with us today. Leslie Greer, who is a sign language instructor at the National Technical Institute for the Deaf, NTID. Also, we have Ken Finton. He is a counselor at the Substance and Alcohol Abuse Intervention Center for the Deaf. We also have Karen Tellinghuisen, who is an accountant at the Rochester Psychiatric Center. We're talking about signing, American Sign Language. There are different modes of sign language. American Sign Language, Signed English. And why are we making such a big fuss about this issue, this language issue? Why don't they just call it signing, period? I really think we need to discuss some background information about your experiences using sign language. So let's start with discussing where we come from. Karen, when did you first learn sign language? How old were you and what did you do before you learned sign language? Could you start with that?
Well, I learned sign language at about 10 years of age. Prior to that, I communicated orally, speaking and through speech reading. I went to the St. Mary's School for the Deaf in Buffalo. That's a private school.
And when did you start signing, Ken?
I was probably 6 years old when I went into a school for the deaf. And since that time, when I got into the 8th grade, I went into a public high school where hearing people were. But I learned signing or started signing when I was at 6 years old.
Well, I started learning it when I was about 12. Before then, I depended on speech reading. And I went to the California School for the Deaf at Riverside. I learned a lot of signing at that time. When I arrived, I knew absolutely nothing about sign language, and it all looked like garbled gesturing to me. But when I was in the dorms at night, my bunkmates would teach me how to sign, and I never got any sleep because I was signing all night.
You learned it overnight, so to speak.
Yes, I really got into it with both feet.
Karen, what kind of teachers, how did you learn? Did you learn through friends?
Well, the teachers taught me through the oral method as I was growing up, and sign language was forbidden at the school until their philosophy changed and they started to approve of total communication. And after that point, sign language was acceptable. but they didn't use that much expression, I think, with their signing. You know, if someone was really angry, they'd show that they were angry, and it was easy to see that.
And Ken, what context did you learn sign language?
Well, in the school for the deaf that I was at, before that, I didn't have any experience with sign language. And when I got into the school, everyone was deaf. Everyone was signing. This was a new experience for me. And after I got into it, it was fine. But prior to that, I didn't know anything about communication with signing. I don't remember anything about sign language. But as soon as I got into that school, I picked it up very quickly. And, you know, from 6 years old on, I remember almost everything. But prior to that, I really can't remember. I got into it at that school for the deaf and I became a signer at that moment. We used a lot of signed English, and I did use my voice. We did have speech classes that I had to go in, and I had to sit and enunciate for the teacher and practice. And I had those classes until I was maybe in 12th grade.
When you're speaking about speech classes and speech, you all took speech classes, and did your teachers tell you, oh, you have wonderful speech, and then when you got out to the world, into the world of business, you realized that people couldn't understand you? Did that perception, was that inaccurate?
Oh, yes, that happened to me frequently. In speech class, they'd tell me I was doing great, that I was wonderful. But then when I interacted with people, I realized they couldn't understand me. And I was really angry that they told me I could speak so well. It was really confusing for me. And now I've stopped using my voice. I'll sign, but I won't sign and use my voice at the same time.
And now do you use both at the same time?
Well, at work, I tried talking twice, but now I just write back and forth to my coworkers. They don't understand me. You know, I wish they'd learn sign language, but they can't really do it.
And Leslie?
Well, I have to admit that my teachers told me the truth. One of my teachers was a good friend of my mother's, and she admitted to me that my speaking ability was not that good. I can get out a word or two, but putting it all together just doesn't come out well. And so I know that I have several friends who have had that experience where they've been told that their speech is very good, but then they can't do well when they interact out with other people. So I didn't have that experience.
Ken, did you have that experience?
My experience was growing up, I learned through speech reading classes, but then at the school for the deaf, there was so much interaction that was involved with sign language. I remember that they asked me to sing Christmas carols, and I was the only deaf kid that they would have sing. All the rest of the kids got involved with the plays and everything, and I wanted to do that, but they got me over singing with the choir as if I was a hearing person, and I was forced to do this. I remember one of the older deaf kids, he was the same as me. They forced him to sign, and he decided to rebel. He made the decision to not join the Christmas carol singing any longer, and that was it for me, too. I decided at that point I wasn't going to do that, wasn't going to be singing. So I got involved with the play, and I had this part in Pinocchio. So I was the good little boy in the Pinocchio play, but I forgot my lines. I mean, I'd gotten used to so long of singing Christmas carols that I just forgot my lines. It was a change for me to try to remember lines.
Related to singing, I was in a private school in Virginia with many hearing people, and my next oldest brother, who was very close to me, told me he wanted me to get involved with this, and I said, no way, I'm not going to do this in front of people. Oh, this was going on around December, and so I showed up at the appointed time, and I had my dog with me, but I couldn't find him. Well, it was just really a bad situation. I learned from then on not to speak in public.
Do you wish that you could speak better?
Yeah, I wish I could, but, you know, today I don't think I'd start talking again. You know, I think, well, maybe if I knew a person really well, someone I know well, like my oldest sister, I'm comfortable talking with her, but with strangers, you know, I just feel no way. I worry what they'll think about me. Maybe my voice will sound funny or I won't pronounce words right. If it's a person I know really well, I'm confident enough to speak, but I really worry about my pronunciation and if they'll correct me or what.
Well, if I can order something in a restaurant and I feel that I can say that particular word very well, then I'll go ahead, and if they don't understand me, then I'll start writing.
And is it important which one you do?
No,
Your
not really.
preference?
If I feel that I can speak it correctly, then I'll be fine, and then we'll just get that word out, and it's very simple. But if we get into speaking in sentences, that's not something that I'm willing to do. I'm proud to be deaf, and I use American Sign Language as my first language. Why should I show that in public, you know?
That's true, okay. Suppose a hearing person comes up to you that doesn't know anything about deaf people, and they've never met a deaf person. Are you willing to use your voice in that situation? Or how do you handle that?
If someone approaches me that doesn't know, I mean, they'll ask me to use my voice, and I feel like it's like exposing myself. I mean, they're asking me to do something that I'm very vulnerable about, and they often are asking it more as a request, not as a command. So I won't do it. I mean, especially even if the person, especially in the situation where the person starts to demand it, then I'll get stubborn and I won't speak. So when I meet people, I will write. I will start with writing. And after we feel comfortable going back and forth, after a few interactions, then I may try speaking or something. And then they usually remark that they are surprised that I'm able to speak. But when that happens, they start speaking to me very quickly, and I can't lip read them that well, and there's misunderstandings develop. So in order to prevent that experience, I just continue writing.
And Karen?
Well, I agree with that. I know it works. Sometimes I'm expected to talk to a person, or I try and talk to a person, and they'll nod, oh yeah, like they're understanding me. And I'll ask them, well, what did I say? And they don't know at all. They're faking like they're understanding me. And boy, that's really frustrating. So I don't want to encourage that sort of misunderstanding. I think using paper and pen is just a lot safer. And that's worked out better for me. Certainly better than nothing. I want to communicate clearly.
Well, if a hearing person knows nothing about deafness, I think it's very important to instruct them in a humorous way. And I might tell them, oh, sorry, I lost the key to my voice box. And then we just go along, and the hearing person just takes that. If somebody asks me to use my voice, I'll tell them instead to go home and stop using their hearing.
And where did you experience this?
Well, when I was in a mainstream setting, I decided that I would start using reading and writing as a method for communication. And someone passed me a note and asked if I could write. So I passed it back and asked if they could read.
Yeah, one time there were some people visiting St. Mary's School for the Deaf, and I'd write back and forth with my friends, and people had asked me if I could speak or not. I went back to visit, and they told me that they thought my speech was getting worse because I started signing, but I don't care. I'm happy with that.
Do you feel that it really has gotten worse, or
Yeah. Well, not that my speech has really gotten worse. When I use my speech, I find it just doesn't work successfully for me. And I'm not willing to try and communicate that way anymore.
Yes, we're talking about speech therapy. How do you feel about speech therapy? Do you have an opinion about that?
Well, I remember sitting across from my speech teacher and working on the enunciation of things. I remember this one time, very well, we were trying to work on the word S sound, and I can't hear an S. I don't know what this is about. What's this about? And they're still saying I can't figure it out. I mean, 30 years, I still don't know what S sounds like. And I was forced to do this, and it became uncomfortable. It didn't really help me with communication. I mean, I could think clearly. I knew what was going on. I could communicate, but I couldn't learn what S sounded like. I mean, I was able to communicate and sign with other people and do things clearly. But there was this hassle and bother of trying to do speech training. So after that, I made the choice to put that stuff aside. If it was needed for a variety of things, I would use my voice, but not as an everyday tool for me for communication.
Okay, we'll continue with this topic. We'll be right back. Stay with us. Welcome back. Today's topic is ASL, American Sign Language by Choice. We have a special group in the audience today, the Girl Scouts. I'd like to welcome them now. We'll continue now with our discussion about speech therapy. Ken was just sharing some experiences about that, and Leslie had something to share.
Well, I remember when we were trying to practice nasal sounds that we would have a piece of paper in front of our face to make sure we were making the appropriate sound, and I feel that there was a bit of a problem sometimes, especially when I was stuffed up from a cold. But we used to practice the word ball all the time, and I didn't know what that meant, but I would say ball, 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 ball. I had no idea what this word meant. And I felt almost like a ventriloquist dummy. You know, I was just parroting things that I didn't understand.
I'd like to share something I had an experience in mainstreaming school, in a mainstream setting. I went to speech therapy also, and during the day, we'd take English and science and so forth. They'd take me out of gym class or art class to go to the speech therapy. I love art, and I really felt bad that I couldn't be involved with that because I had to go to speech therapy. I'd rather substitute one of the other courses instead. But that was really very disappointing to me. And that's still a point of resentment that I have.
You're related to the mainstream issue, which is really a very oppressive type of situation. I would sometimes have private tutoring after school in the evening, so I felt that I was working from morning till night. That was really tough.
Yeah, I think we had to go to class with the sisters on Monday, Wednesday, and Friday 3 times a week for speech therapy. And they'd videotape us using our voice, and on Friday give us feedback about everything we mispronounced. You talked about saying ball over and over again. I know I'd mispronounce that and say P instead of B. And they just harp on that again and again and again until, finally I got to college and I had to go to more speech therapy. I think I was doing it for my mother's sake. And I kept up with that. And then I'd go out to a restaurant to order something, and the waitress still couldn't understand me. After all that speech therapy, I mean, why put up with it? Talk about a waste of time.
One thing that helped me a little bit as I think back about it, the speech classes were okay, and the audiologist, the testing that you had to go through, they'd put these headphones on, you'd raise your hand if you could hear it in this ear, the other ear, and if you could hear a word, you were supposed to speak the word. And after we went through that, I mean, years and years and years of this, 13, 14 years, I found it easy in some ways to just pay attention to my ears. I mean, baseball, boy, airplane. I can remember, like, the order of the test. And they'd say, oh, you're very good, Ken. And I'd sit back and, smirk a little. So I found a way to beat the system. And it was interesting to me that inside I was really bothered by this whole idea of the professionalism of the teachers and the audiologists and whatnot, saying that you've got to do this and you've got to do that. And my friends didn't have to do this stuff. I mean, why'd they pick me up for this sort of training? I still think about it. It bothers me still.
And still, I think about the issue of ASL, American Sign Language. I grew up using sign language because my parents are deaf as well. And then when I got into college, people started calling it ASL, and I always thought it was signed English. It really didn't have a name for it, a label for it. And it really made me think. People who don't grow up using sign language and later learn sign language have a much more positive experience. They treasure that skill more. They have a much more positive feeling and attitude about it. I grew up using sign language and kind of took it for granted. I really didn't know what it was, didn't pay much attention. I really took ASL for granted, and people who learn it later find it much more valuable.
Yeah, many people who grow up with their parents who are deaf and use really the purest form of American Sign Language haven't experienced the frustration that we've experienced. As soon as we've gone through this frustrating experience and then learned American Sign Language and found out how wonderful it is to communicate, then we really appreciate it. But people who grow up with it just don't realize what we've had to go through. And so I'm really not happy about what I had to go through. And I would never want to go back to being oral.
Do you think the people that grow up signing take ASL for granted?
No. Growing up, I learned ASL from the school for the deaf. I mean, I didn't know the name for it or anything, but it really didn't matter to me. Later, I met an interpreter, and they told me that it was American Sign Language. This was at college. And I learned that, this signing stuff was American Sign Language. And I got more confused. I mean, I started to pay attention to my signing, if you know what I mean. I became very aware of my hands. I mean, this was sort of a bother to myself, paying attention to what I was saying all the time. Up until that point, I hadn't even thought about it. It was just the way that you talked. It was to use your hands. Now I'm comfortable with it. I mean, I've made my choice. Signing is the way that's best for me to communicate.
Were you talking about the awkwardness with using sign language? For example, if you're talking with deaf people using American Sign Language, and if a hearing person comes along, you tend to gear towards more signed English.
I do that.
Some people ask you why that happens, and it really is not a conscious decision sometimes. That happens just when you know that a hearing person is there. Do you have a feeling of why that happens?
Yeah, well, when I'm talking with someone using American Sign Language, often I feel that I have to go back and repeat what I've said using more of an English mode, and I often feel that I have to sign more slowly so that they will understand me, and I keep going back and forth, so I'm telling the story twice, as a matter of fact.
Often it happens with a mixed deaf hearing group. You might be signing an ASL and the hearing person just won't understand you. So you start to change to something a lot more like English and they'll start to understand because they can't catch it when you're signing it in ASL. So there's a real tendency to do that and you want them to understand it. You figure maybe they'll understand it better later, but...
Do you think that when you're signing an ASL and someone who's hearing approaches the group, do you want to protect your ASL and not let them see it so they can't take advantage of it?
I think that could be one possible explanation for that. I feel that hearing people often change our language, and internally I have this sort of subconscious feeling that I don't want to have to alter my language for them. I just want to be able to express myself in the way I'm most comfortable.
I'd like to add that in my situation growing up, when I got together with hearing people that communicated with me, I would tend to use English. I mean, especially with my teachers, I would use signed English with them. And as I grow up, I never really saw a teacher using American Sign Language unless they were deaf. And if they were deaf, then they would use American Sign Language. But I never had seen that until later in my life. Growing up, I didn't have that experience. So now, my safest assumption is to use signed English with hearing people until I find out they can use American Sign Language, then I'll use American Sign Language with them, if you see what I mean. When I'm introduced with people and they present me with American Sign Language, then of course I'll go with that way with them. But I hadn't had that exposure with hearing people using ASL when I was growing up.
It's rare anyway, yeah.
Well, when I went to a residential school for the deaf, we would use American Sign Language. And the hearing people there could also use that. And then I became used to it in California as well. And then when I got to NTID, I was appalled at how very unskilled I found people. I felt that the D in NTID for the deaf would pretty much imply that people could use American Sign Language very appropriately and very well. I just actually felt that I wanted to go back to the school for the deaf where it was so much better.
On the college level, it's interesting because when you're using sign language at home, it's different than here in Rochester. When I go home with my family, also when I was in college, I would use American Sign Language with my family when I went home for the weekends. And my mother would, I don't mean this in a negative way, but in the situation at home, my mother would say, you know, I understand English. You can say it in English. You think that since you went to college, your intelligence is going to increase so much, but you come home and you're very different, and I don't know as if you're expecting me to be smart enough. I felt comfortable using American Sign Language, but my mother thought that might be an insult to her intelligence. I didn't want to look down on her, and I really thought that the older generation, people tend to sign more formally, more in an English mode. They look more educated, and they also think that signed English is a more educated way of signing. That's a perception that the older generation seems to have. Do you have a feeling about that?
Well, remember, when I went to the residential school, I didn't use my mouth very much. I just used American Sign Language. But then when I went to college, I started incorporating a lot more lip movements that looked like English. And then when I'd go back to visit friends, they'd say, "What the heck are you doing? This doesn't look natural for you." They thought I was putting on airs. And so I realized that I was being strongly influenced by the college environment that I was in. And I often felt that I was stuck in the middle. I didn't quite know which type of mode I should use, whether I should use a lot of lip movement or whether I shouldn't. So it was awkward.
Yeah, I'd say I had the same experience. It was tough for me. Often I'd use a lot of English mouth movement, or sometimes I'd even use my voice on and off. And some people would prefer both. I'd be hanging out with some students who were heavily dependent on speech reading, and I'd use a lot of English mouth movement. And then I'd meet other friends who can't lip read at all, and I'd want to satisfy everyone at the same time. And, you know, that's what it was. I wanted to communicate with people effectively.
Ken, do you think that using American Sign Language means that someone is less educated?
No, I don't agree with that. I mean, I think ASL it's a language all on its own. It stands by itself. Deaf people that use ASL may be smart or not so smart, but the language itself does not speak to that. I mean, it's no indication. It's a language all by itself. When I got into college and learned about social work, which was my major, my field of study, I studied this stuff in signed English. I mean, it was taught to me in English. And I got all this learning in English, and I started to do the work. And a deaf person would come in and start using American Sign Language, and I had to do this translation bit in my head from all this English learning into American Sign Language work. And after a while, I was able to get smooth with it, but it was a struggle.
Well, thank you, and we'll continue with this in just a moment with our audience participation. We'll be right back after a word with our sponsor. Thank you for staying with us. I would like to talk more in depth about American Sign Language now. American Sign Language, where did that come from? Do you know the history about it?
Well, if we look at sign as a continuum, the person who first named it American Sign Language was a linguist named Stokey. He set it up in a kind of an idea of a circle so that he could find many consistencies among different sign systems, and then they all tie together in one way.
Yes, we have a question over here.
What is American Sign Language? I mean, really, what is this item? You see this in the show? Perhaps, you pick up ASL as slang? Or, I want to know what is ASL? I mean, you talk about ASL by choice. You make this choice to use ASL as your language. How did you make that choice? What is this choice?
Some people seem to think that sign language is one thing, and ASL is one part of sign language.
Well, as I was talking about the circle, Stokey did a lot of research and found ASL and examined all the different parts of it, and then I'm trying to explain what this all means. Can any of you help me?
Oh, I don't know. My understanding of American Sign Language is, if you show a picture, you're communicating to a certain extent in a pictorial way. English, I'm driving in a blue car, yesterday. I'm driving in a blue car yesterday. Yesterday, blue car, I drove along. So you can see the change in order between the two items. That's one example of American Sign Language.
Yes, and you wanted to clarify?
But in the example you just gave, driving blue car, fine. I want to see more of that on the show rather than this signing and using your lips and using the signed English thing. Why don't you just, button the lip and use American Sign Language? Use American Sign Language. Get into it. I want to see more American Sign Language than this signed English stuff.
I think the reason why people gravitate towards English is, perhaps they're more comfortable with it. And also as they think about a philosophy like total communication, I come from a background with English and American Sign Language myself. I've learned both ways, and I use whatever I feel most comfortable with.
Perhaps I can answer your question. When you ask me about using American Sign Language, you asked me in English. So I'm mode matching is what I'm doing. You asked me in English, I'm not going to respond to you in American Sign Language. That would be inappropriate. I'm not sure if you know or not how you're expressing this to me, but the way you express it to me is if you express it to me in American Sign Language, then I would do that. Recently, Jackie asked me a few questions in English, so I had to think about them in English. So I answered in a mode match sort of way. I can use American Sign Language, but I can also use English. When I think of most deaf folks, they're able to switch back and forth between signed English and ASL. This is just my opinion. My preference is to use straight ASL. This mode switching stuff is for the birds, but I do have this skill in order to mode switch between signed English and American Sign Language, and I just don't think about it. It's automatic. When I meet people, I go to the mode that's easiest for both of us. It's frustrating. It's difficult. I'll start with American Sign Language, and then I'll shift over to something we can both use. So, I don't know. Maybe that's an answer to your question. I'm not sure.
I'd like to add something.
Okay, Leslie?
ASL is a visual form of communication, and it has many rules. One of the rules is the way you get someone's attention, and I've demonstrated some of these ways. And then we set up the place. But in English, there's a different type of word order. And I don't feel that deaf people, I don't feel that ASL is as restricted a word order. I feel that you can play with them a little bit more. So to make it more clear, I'd say that total communication is a philosophy. And there are a variety of tools that you can use under total communication: sign language, ASL, finger spelling, writing, speaking, speech reading, all of those things. And if a child or an adult chooses any one of those tools, they need to pick the one that's most appropriate. If they cannot function in one particular mode, then they need not to. When you use your voice and you sign at the same time, that's not total communication. That's what they call simultaneous communication, or otherwise known as SIMCOM.
And total communication is a philosophy. SIMCOM is a tool. Uh-oh.
Possibly.
Is that what you mean? Is it a mode of communication?
Well, I'd say that often simultaneous communication was something that was required in the classroom.
Is that in conflict with the philosophy then?
It can be. When I hear about a total communication philosophy, that doesn't necessarily mean SIMCOM, but that's what a lot of people think it means. And so I think total communication, it's important to analyze the individual, and you can make use of all of these tools or any of them.
And when a school says that it's using total communication, you feel it really isn't?
Often, yes.
There's a question out here in the audience.
Hi. My experience has been very similar to you. I went into a school for the deaf when I was 13 years old. Up until that, I'd been in a public high school, hearing high school. My experience in speech therapy was pretty awful. It was disgusting. Saying ball, ball, ball. I mean, for 13 years, I'm working on ball, ball, ball. Nothing more sophisticated than this. I mean, I had a whole lot of other skills, but now I'm really good at saying ball, though. When I think of these applications in my life experience and what it means to me, I got into the Clark School, you know? I mean, they're big on moving the lips there. So Kathy Holsworth has a similar experience. Changing, you know, I mean, a little bit off the point. I'm sorry. Let me get back into this. When I got back in here, I knew how to, when I got here, I knew how to sign, and I got into college. And the first thing the two of us did was start using our oral skills with everybody. And they all looked like us, like our friends looked at us like we'd been brainwashed. And it's sad to say, but it was true.
Do we have another comment for the question from the audience?
Okay. I notice with children that the influence that the mainstreaming environment has on children. They use oral skills or total communication or SIMCOM. I mean, where does ASL fit in that picture? Is it diminishing or is it growing, the use of American Sign Language? Is it presented with a positive attitude? I notice a lot of people look down on ASL, and they think this is a negative. There's a negative value attached to the use of American Sign Language.
Go ahead, Leslie.
Yeah, it's very sad that in mainstream situations they offer foreign languages like French and Spanish, but why not ASL? Why isn't that included in the curriculum choice? If there are deaf children who sign and they understand ASL rules, that's wonderful, but very often that type of coursework is missing. And so I think that mainstreaming needs to include the concepts of interpreters, note-taking, etc. But often I see a bunch of classes for hearing children and then one special classroom set aside for deaf students. That's not mainstreaming. Mainstreaming means you allow the children to be in classes with other hearing people with the appropriate support services. But often they call it mainstreaming when the kids are in a different classroom, and that doesn't have anything to do with actual mainstreaming. You know, they're only together for lunchtime and recess. It's not effective mainstreaming at all. I think that the true spirit of mainstreaming includes every type of support service necessary for the student to succeed.
And Ailey?
I have a question for you. You've spoken about your experiences with speech training and the years of learning that were for what? I'm wondering, do the kids now think that it's important to continue with speech training? Or should we do something to stop all this speech training that's happening? I have a child now, and she's signing, and in our everyday experience, we communicate with each other. We use sign language. You know, we sometimes use signed English, how are you, and those kinds of things. And sometimes we use American Sign Language. I communicate in my own way every day with my child. With speech training, I mean, if my daughter was deaf, in terms of speech training, and if she had some hearing, I would encourage her to do that. Because in the future, then she would have more choices.
Mm-hmm.
She would have more than what I had. I mean, I think she should be given the opportunity to grab those choices and make use of them. And, you know, residual hearing and all that stuff. And later on, when she decides that she doesn't want to speak any longer, that's her choice to make at that time. But in the beginning, I think we should be offering children more choices.
Yeah.
I'm glad to have speech training. I mean, I think that's important. I mean, sometimes it was frustrating and not so much fun and everything, but if I didn't have that experience in my lifetime, I wouldn't be who I am today. So I'm not really sure. It's a hard choice to make, to look into the future and say, well, this isn't appropriate for this child at this time, not knowing what the future will bring.
I look at kids today, I think each child needs to have an opportunity to choose by himself or herself whether they want to use sign language or speech reading and talking. And as they grow up, they need to find their own preferences and go with that. All the various tools that Leslie was talking about. Children need to have the ability to make those choices.
Are you talking about hearing or deaf children?
Deaf.
Ah, deaf, okay. Suppose the parents want the children to use American Sign Language. Then they need to use an adult form of language with them. Like if the parents baby talk to the children in sign language, then they won't really use ASL. They won't learn how to. We need not to use baby words with them. We need to help them learn a sophisticated American Sign Language, and they can pick it up if we're modeling that for them. So I think it's really up to the individual. If someone obviously can succeed using their voice, then I think that we should support them. Okay, let me explain a little bit about my background. I was born hearing, as a matter of fact, and I became very ill at the age of 2. I was in Washington, D.C. at that time, and I was put in the hospital, and after a while, the doctors found out that I was deaf. But they told my parents, oh, don't worry, she'll be able to speak just the way hearing children do.
Excuse me for interrupting you. We need to take a break, but then as soon as we come back, we'll continue with your story.
Okay, fine.
Okay. Welcome back. We're talking about ASL by choice. We have our guests Leslie, Karen, and Ken. And Leslie was just talking about her experience with speech therapy. Could you continue that? And about traveling.
Well, okay, my mom called the John Tracy Clinic, and they suggested that I go to the University of Virginia to become to get used to all this stuff and go to an audiologist and that type of thing, and to teach me how to use the residual hearing. Anyway, my dad was in the Army, and we moved a lot, and they ended up we moved to California and we called the Stanford University, and they said, oh, what you've been told in Virginia was wrong. And I started to learn all over again how to use my hearing and how to use my oral skills, and I learned how to say words all over again and how to put them together again, and just when I was getting comfortable with that, Dad was transferred again. So then we moved to a new location, and they said, oh, sorry, what you've experienced was wrong. I said, wrong? Again? So it seems to me that every time we moved, I found that the new place didn't approve of the past methods I had been trained in. So with moving all over like that, I had a very difficult time. So when I finally got back to Virginia, my father decided to leave the Army for my sake. My father had a goal to become a general, but then he decided to get out of the Army and moved to California, where I was placed in a mainstream situation. And I'll tell you, I had the same problem again. And when I turned 12, I just finally came to the conclusion that I was not going to use my voice and go through the same frustrations. So I was transferred into a residential school for the deaf, and the teacher there was very willing to allow the children not to use their voices if it seemed that they were not going to be successful with it.
That's very good advice. Yep. Speech table, please.
My question that I'd like to share something, and I'd like to ask a question. When we're talking about ASL by choice, for me, my choice of sign language is a choice that I make over using my voice. When I go home to my family, they don't use sign language, so I go back to them, go with them, and my eyes get tired, my voice is dry, my throat hurts, but I have to use my voice. I mean, I'll stay up in Rochester till 2, 3 in the morning chatting with my friends in American Sign Language and not feel tired at all about it. But I'll go to visit my parents and I'll be drowsy after a couple hours, especially because of so many misunderstandings that develop in those kinds of conversations. Do we want to go to the ballpark? Do we want to go to the mall? Do we, to the park what? It's all kinds of frustrations happening. I mean, I was 14, they'll say 14, 4, teen, are we talking about age? Are we talking about place? I mean, in American Sign Language, it's so simple. To use my voice, I feel, for me, is very frustrating and bothersome. I mean, I was raised with speech training all my life, similar to the experiences that you had. What Leslie said, when you found ASL, you picked it up real quick. It's something you'd never seen before. You thought it was great. I mean, this was the best stuff. You were able to party and play with your friends and gather a whole lot of choices that were just really important. I'm wondering, how we can show that American Sign Language is so important to us more and more. I work with children at the Rochester School for the Deaf with language and speech training and all kinds of different things, and total communication approach. And they build the vocabulary in sign language as they do in English. I mean, they're not losing anything in English as a result of learning American Sign Language. There's this big worry that you're going to develop a deficit in English. I don't know. That was my experience.
Thank you. And here's another comment from our studio audience. Arden.
This is a question for the guests on the panel. Growing up, I was hearing, I was able to hear the national anthem, and I was able to learn about our country and all the important things in that. And I told my parents, we're supposed to say like the Pledge of Allegiance and everything in the morning, at school, and they would say they didn't know much about that. That's sort of a hearing thing. And I'm wondering for you, and now as adults, with the speech training that you had, did you ever have the chance to learn about the national anthem? The Pledge of Allegiance, respecting the flag and loyalty and all that stuff. Did you have to learn those things? Did you learn it in sign, or did you learn it through an oral approach?
Yes, Karen?
Well, first, as I was growing up oral and speech reading a lot, till about the 2nd grade. It was 2nd grade when I first started to sign, and after that I used sign language from 2nd grade on out.
Could you elaborate that a little bit more?
At the School for the Deaf, we did do the Pledge of Allegiance. We did do the National Anthem. I mean, I have to admit, I was just copying the teacher. I didn't understand a bit of what she was doing. But I was just copying. I mean, that was what I was supposed to do, the Pledge of Allegiance, the National Anthem. I knew what all that stuff was. But now I have a daughter who's 2.5. And there's a lot of things that my daughter knows about U.S. history and all this different stuff. And I'm just amazed. She tells me all these things. And I don't know what she's talking about. I'm learning now at 30 years old some things my daughter is teaching me that I should have learned when I was that young.
Mm-hmm.
I didn't have that experience growing up to learn those items. So I would respond yes to your question. I missed a lot of those things too.
I was in the same grade as my brother, but we were in the mainstream classes, and often my brother would orally interpret for me some of the things that went on. But in the mainstream situation, I really didn't understand what was going on. I'd say, "What is this pledge for?" And they'd just not really explain it to me very well. I felt that I didn't really get a strong education in a mainstream situation. All they could think about was my use of residual hearing and my speech training. They didn't really tell me what anything meant. I would see people with their hands over their heart and they wouldn't tell me what it meant. But then sometimes I'd have some people explain things for me in the School for the Deaf, and then I'd finally start to understand what was going on, and then I was very angered about what I didn't learn in the mainstream setting.
Okay. Yes, go
I think
ahead.
perhaps I have an answer
Debbie.
to Arden's question. I had the same experience that he had. You know, maybe when I was 8 years old, the teacher started with the Pledge of Allegiance without, I just copied her lip movement. I didn't know what she was saying. So in the last sentence, equality for all, I got that one, but I didn't understand the rest of it. And it was pretty interesting that was the only thing that I got out of that whole Pledge of Allegiance. Before we were talking about writing back and forth, I'm wondering, are your skills in English diminished by your ability to use American Sign Language, or are your skills in American Sign Language diminished by your use of English? I mean, sometimes are you not able to understand a question, but then you can understand it written down?
Affecting your English skills, you mean, ASL affecting that?
Well, I have to disagree with you. I think that a lot of times we've heard that ASL, a strong use of ASL would diminish our English skills. And I think that the key is reading, and that's what helps us improve our English. Do you think that ASL can really affect our ability to read? I say no.
True.
I can share a story I have about this. I can hear some, especially when I was growing up, I would use a hearing aid, so I could pick up a few things. And I learned English structure, and I knew about that stuff, but my writing skills were not so hot. When I got into college, the first course that I took, I started to write, and I lost it. I couldn't figure out how to get my thoughts into English. So what I did was I gave this paper to my wife and asked, would you mind writing this for me? I said it was really hard. I didn't know what to do. I didn't know how to say it. So she would write down, and that's how you say it. So then I would hand it to my teacher and get an A, and thanks, and I would get this great A, but it wasn't me. So the second, third course, this diminished her use of, my use of her to do my papers diminished. And I built my skills in English so that I could do 20-page papers. I still, have problems with certain items in English, but to a certain extent it doesn't care. I'm able to get a lot done anyways.
I'd like to add a little bit to that. At work, naturally I'll miss a couple words here and there, but it seems I can always understand the conversation or the vocabulary, even the sentences related to work. Well, maybe not the sentences so much, but I'll catch the key words, and that's really important for me.
Okay, thank you.
You spoke about writing. Sometimes speech, your use of speech is embarrassing, but sometimes you make mistakes in writing. Are you embarrassed by that? It's the same as speaking. It's English. Does that embarrass you as much as your speech ability does?
No, if a person doesn't understand my speech, say twice, that's it. From there on out, I'm going to write back and forth. And it's better. We can communicate that way. If I keep trying to communicate with them orally, it's just going to get more and more frustrating.
Yeah, but you
I
make
think it's
mistakes.
pronunciation. It's pronunciation errors that throw them off.
Also, you can be embarrassed by your skills in English. Is that what you're talking about? If people think that you have lousy English skills?
Oh, yes. I used to work at Kodak, and I would send notes to people, and then sometimes they'd give me a funny look, like they didn't understand what I had written, and then I'd ask for it back, and then I'd sign the message to myself and think, oh, that's why this message didn't make sense. So then I would rewrite the message so that it would be more clear.
In my communication with people, I never really have long written conversations. I mean, they're pretty brief, 1, 2, 3 sentences, and then it's their turn. So I'm never really embarrassed about it. Like if I go to McDonald's, I mean, I'm 30 years old, right? I go into McDonald's and I write down that I want 3 hamburgers, 2 French fries, and 2 Cokes. I mean, there's no sentences here. There's not a whole lot of English structure involved with this. I mean, they understand what this says, and they should get it. I mean, that's English, just like anything else. So, must I put down, I want 3 hamburgers? No, I don't need to do that, and it's not really embarrassing.
It's an interesting discussion that we're having about American Sign Language and your different perspectives that you've had. Your value of American Sign Language. Really, we don't know what... Some people say you don't know what you have until you lose it, but that's really not true with our value of American Sign Language. Thank you for watching our program today. It's been a wonderful discussion. Thank you. Thank you for joining us today. Thank you, Karen and Ken and Leslie. We've really enjoyed our discussion today, some of your experiences that you've had. Thank you so much for being with us, and thank you to our studio audience.